Every Sunday morning, as the church bells rang softly in the distance and the city still stretched itself awake, an elderly man in a worn coat and a soldier's cap would appear at the gates of the military cemetery. He walked slowly but with purpose, his back slightly hunched with age, and his left hand clutching a modest bouquet of fresh flowers, always white lilies. Without speaking to anyone, he made his way down the stone paths, past rows of identical headstones, until he reached one in particular. The name etched into the marble was clean and precise, the lettering sharp against the weathered stone, Private Thomas E. Callahan, 1948 to 1969. The man would kneel, place the flowers gently at the base of the grave, and sit on the nearby bench for about an hour, staring at the name as if in deep conversation. He never cried. He never prayed aloud. He never missed a Sunday, not even in the snow or rain. Groundskeepers began to notice his routine, wondering if he was a father, a brother, or perhaps a surviving comrade. The truth was, he was none of those. His name was Walter Briggs, a 75-year-old retired machinist and Vietnam War veteran who had never met Thomas Callahan in his life. Walter had only seen the young man once, through the thick jungle haze of a war zone nearly half a century ago. That moment, brief and blurred by adrenaline and chaos, had altered the entire trajectory of Walter's life. During an ambush in the central highlands of Vietnam, Walter's squad had been surrounded and disoriented. As he scrambled for cover, bullets slicing through the leaves, he stumbled, vulnerable and exposed. Then came a shot from behind, not aimed at Walter, but at the enemy charging toward him. A single bullet fired from somewhere in the brush had downed the attacker, saving Walter's life by a margin no wider than a heartbeat. Later, when the area was cleared, Walter had asked who it was that fired that shot. One of the medics pointed silently to a stretcher being loaded onto a helicopter. "New guy," the medic said. "Didn't make it. Name's Callahan." Walter never forgot that name. He didn't know where Callahan was from, what he liked to eat, or whether he had someone waiting back home. But over the years, as Walter built his life, married, raised children, and eventually grew old, he felt that every second of borrowed time he'd been granted came from that single act of sacrifice. It took him decades to track down the grave, years of writing letters, filing veteran records requests, even hiring a researcher. When he finally found it, tucked in the northeast quadrant of the National Cemetery, he visited for the first time with trembling hands and tears that refused to fall. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not his wife before she passed, not his children, not even the VA counselors he saw occasionally. The act became his own quiet penance, a promise to never let Thomas Callahan become just another name etched in stone. Every flower laid was a thank you he never got to say. Every Sunday visit was an acknowledgement that his life had value only because someone else's had been cut short. And in that cemetery, week after week, Walter found a peace he couldn't explain. To the staff, he became simply the silent visitor. Some speculated a familial tie, others assumed survivor's guilt, but none ever asked. It was enough to see the tenderness with which he knelt, the consistency with which he came. And so the routine went on, season after season, as Walter aged and the world moved forward around him. Yet he remained, loyal, quiet, faithful to the memory of a stranger whose selfless act had become the bedrock of his existence. And though the cemetery was filled with thousands of names, Walter saw only one. Only Callahan. The years passed with quiet certainty, and though Walter's back stooped lower and his legs protested more with each Sunday walk, he never failed to arrive at Callahan's grave before noon. By now, even the security guard at the cemetery gate nodded respectfully when he saw him. Visitors often watched from a distance, sensing the weight of the ritual but never disturbing it. Some whispered about the man who came with lilies and sat without speaking. A local woman who jogged through the cemetery paths called him, the man who waits for the dead. Children walking with their parents asked if he was mourning his son. No one knew the truth, and Walter never offered it. But change crept in slowly, as it always does. One spring, Walter arrived to find a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, guided by a young history teacher pointing out notable graves. As Walter stepped toward his usual spot, the teacher glanced up and paused, clearly recognizing the moment. She gently gestured to the class to stay back as Walter knelt by Callahan's grave, laid down the lilies, and bowed his head in silence. Afterward, she approached him softly and asked if he would like to speak to the students. Walter shook his head at first, but then something shifted. He looked at her, eyes glassy yet firm, and asked, "Do they know what it cost?" She said they were learning, and he replied, "Then maybe it's time someone told them." That was the first time he spoke about Callahan in public. Standing there in the sun, voice rough from disuse, Walter told them about a day in the jungle, about how a nameless stranger had changed everything for a man who wasn't ready to die. The children listened, wide-eyed and still, and afterward, one of them walked over and placed a small drawing on the grave, a sketch of two soldiers holding hands. Walter's hands trembled as he picked it up, and for the first time in decades, he felt less alone. Word began to spread slowly. An article appeared in the local paper titled, "The Man Who Thanks the Dead." It was brief, anonymous, and based mostly on observation, but the image of an old veteran visiting a grave every Sunday caught attention. A few weeks later, a journalist left a card at the grave with a note, "Would love to hear your story, just once." Walter ignored it. He had no need for cameras or headlines. But something about the growing attention unsettled him, not because it intruded, but because he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep the ritual. His hands were beginning to fail him. One Sunday, his leg gave out and he collapsed on the gravel path just a few feet from Callahan's grave. The security guard rushed over and helped him up, brushing off Walter's protests and insisting on calling a doctor. Walter stayed stubbornly silent, but he could feel the truth creeping in. He wouldn't be able to do this forever. At night, he began writing letters, not to Callahan, but about him. Memories, fragments, thoughts he'd buried deep, as if recording them would help preserve what he feared would vanish with him. In one letter, he wrote, "You didn't know me, but I carry you. I've carried you every day of my life, in choices, in second chances, in every quiet morning I got to see because you never got another." He placed the letters in a small box and kept it under his bed. Meanwhile, the cemetery staff began to leave a chair near the grave every Sunday, knowing he would need it. And as the season turned toward fall, Walter's movements grew slower, his breathing heavier, but he still came. One day, a middle-aged man in a clean-pressed suit arrived at the cemetery, holding a newspaper clipping. He approached Walter cautiously and asked if he was the man from the article. Walter nodded. The man introduced himself as Michael Callahan, Thomas's nephew. He said no one in the family had known exactly what. The next few months after that dinner felt like borrowed time to Walter, but for the first time in years, he didn't mind. Every Sunday visit to the grave now felt different, not heavier, but warmer, like his ritual had grown roots beyond himself. The Callahan family began occasionally joining him at the cemetery. Sometimes it was just Michael, bringing a cup of coffee and sitting beside Walter without saying much. Sometimes it was Michael's daughter, a teenager with headphones always around her neck, who stood awkwardly until Walter told her about the lilies, why he always brought lilies, and then she started picking them herself from her family's garden. They even came on days that weren't Sunday, and Walter stopped feeling like the only person in the world who remembered that one nameless act of sacrifice. More than that, he started to feel that Callahan was no longer alone either. Then came the idea, a small plaque. Nothing grand. Just a quiet addition to the gravestone, he gave a stranger a second chance. At first, Walter resisted. He didn't want to draw attention, didn't want to rewrite a life with headlines or ceremonies. But Michael said it wasn't for others to look at, it was for the family, and for Walter too. The words weren't about praise, but memory. Walter agreed, and the plaque was added one early spring morning. A few veterans from the area showed up, some quietly nodding in recognition, others simply standing in silence. Walter looked around and realized he had become the keeper of this memory not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. He had taken a debt that could never be repaid and turned it into devotion. He no longer needed to explain why he came, because others now knew, and some even followed suit, leaving small notes, flowers, a military pin, a folded flag. One day, Walter arrived to find a small stone on the grave with the words, "I was saved too." No name. No explanation. But Walter understood. And that was enough. But time, as always, moves without pause. Walter's health began to slip. The walks took longer. He leaned heavier on his cane. Eventually, one Sunday, he didn't arrive at all. Michael, concerned, called the local clinic and found out Walter had been taken in 2 days prior after collapsing near his home. Michael visited, bringing updates and jokes and photos of the family, but Walter barely had the strength to speak. One evening, as Michael prepared to leave, Walter gripped his wrist and whispered something, "If I don't make it, just make sure he's not forgotten." Michael promised. A few days later, Walter passed quietly in his sleep. The funeral was small but filled with familiar faces. A military honor guard folded a flag. Michael gave a short speech. But the most touching moment came after the service, when Michael led a small group, family, friends, and a few strangers who had read Walter's story in the paper, back to Callahan's grave. There, next to the plaque Walter had once resisted, they added another, "And the man he saved never forgot." For weeks after, people continued to visit the gravesite. Someone left lilies every Sunday. No one ever saw who. Then, months later, the story resurfaced. A journalist published a full feature titled "The Silent Visitor," chronicling the decades Walter had spent honoring a stranger. The story spread online, and thousands shared it with messages like, "This is what real remembrance looks like," and "Never forget the cost." Schools began teaching it as part of lessons about unseen sacrifices. Veterans who had once felt invisible wrote letters saying they felt seen. The ripple Walter created had become a wave. And though he was gone, his act of remembrance had birthed hundreds more. Years later, Michael's daughter, now grown, stood at the grave with her own child and told him, "This is where your great-uncle lies, and this is where a man sat every week to say thank you." The child didn't fully understand, but he looked at the 2 plaques and nodded, placing a single lily down. The sun filtered through the trees, and the silence around the grave felt not lonely, but full. The seat Walter had used every Sunday had been replaced by a small bench, donated by the town with a plaque of its own, for those who never forgot. People came from other towns just to sit there. Some prayed. Some cried. Some just sat and looked at the names. And somewhere in the unseen weight of quiet footsteps and whispered gratitude, Walter's wish was fulfilled, not to be remembered himself, but to make sure Callahan never faded. In the end, it wasn't the medals or the uniforms or the speeches that kept memories alive. It was the act of showing up, again and again, without fanfare, without recognition. Just a man and a memory. Just a life given meaning through another. Just a bench under a tree, where strangers sat and remembered a stranger who gave everything, and the man who never let him be forgotten.